Xin chào quý vị.
I saw you walking down the street the other day. I only want to meet you, wanted you to walk my way. Looking at the other girls, you didn't see me, and my heart's still free. I can give you love in a very special way. If you only let me keep you for another day. The happiness that I would bring together with you, with you, with you, with you. And my heart's still free. Magic night, did I dream about the one I love? Was I thinking like a lady in love? And I knew you was feeling lonely. Magic night.
She said, walked into the club. I turned around and heard the sound of footsteps on the floor. That was just my prediction. Now I'm telling you, I need some time to get it right. Your love's gonna see it through. Yes, I'm down, don't you know? I never gonna let you go. Don't go. Oh, baby, make your mind up. Give me what you got. Fix me with your loving show and tell me life. Hey, go get a doctor. Doctor, can't too late. Another night I feel alright. My love for you. Yes, I'm down, don't you know? I never gonna let you go. Don't go. you all my love, girl. But you just threw it all away. And now there's nothing left to do. No words left to say. I never thought the day would come, my love, that you'd deceive me and be untrue. So now you go your way, and I'll go mine. But I'm crying over you. As I sat by my window, just thinking of you, the pain and deception which broke my heart too. But now that I see that you're not loving me, oh baby, can't see just what you do to me. Crying over you is all I can do when you love someone. I'm crying over you, then you believe that all your love is true. But now you're playing someone new, but I'm crying over you. Crying over you, that's why I'm crying over. Crying over you, that's why I'm crying. Those tears are my pillow, all because of you. But now the time's come to find somebody new. I'm looking for someone to wipe away the tears, someone to love me while you're not here. Crying over you, that's why I'm crying over. Crying over you, that's why I'm crying. Crying over you is all I can do when I love someone. I'm crying over you. You tell me to believe that all your love is true, but now you're feeling someone new, and I'm crying over you. Over you. It goes down, 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 anyway you want it, baby. My love for you, baby. It's not my love for you, baby. It's not the roller coaster. It goes up, down, down, anyway you want it, baby.
Thank you so much. Please, everyone who's joined us tonight, let us know where you're calling in from in our comment section, and please show some love to our in-house DJ Puzzle with the Spins. He's going to be taking us through all his musical stylings again for another episode of Accented IRL, a collaboration of a virtual event series that we're doing with the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Welcome to the show. For those of y'all who are returning with us. For all of y'all who are new, welcome to the show. My name is Nguyen. I am the producer and MC for tonight's show. I'll also be moderating the Q&A later tonight following our conversation. We really have an incredible lineup of guests here for you tonight, as well as some really exciting conversation. We've been having a lot of exciting conversations. To give you all a little bit of context for the show is also co-hosted by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, and we believe that empowering Vietnamese voices around the world, that the stories, imaginaries, and poetics of a thriving Vietnamese diaspora can unite our global community. Our mission is to celebrate and foster diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian voices. Our complex and diverse stories must be championed and passed on to current and future generations because we are refugees, immigrants, survivors, and descendants, and our stories must be heard. Tonight's conversation is centered around this theme of writers in diaspora, and we've brought together an incredible lineup of writers in diaspora for you all to join in this intimate conversation here with us tonight. I also want to give a really quick shout out before we start to our bookstore partner, Eastwind Books of Berkeley, where all the books that are mentioned tonight, all the books that we'll be highlighting and talking about, you can find from Asia or Eastwind Books of Berkeley at asiabookcenter.com, and we'll drop all these links for you in the chat. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host, the illustrious Viet Nguyen, who is the author of The Sympathizer, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam in the Memory of War, The Refugees, and Race and Resistance, Literature, Politics, and Asian America. His most recent book that was recently released in March is The Committed, the highly anticipated sequel to The Sympathizer. Please give it up, y'all, for our host, Viet Nguyen.
Philip, DJ Puzzle, so good to be back. I think I just saw you like last week, if I remember right. Yeah. How you guys doing?
We're supposed to be on vacation. We're supposed to be on vacation soon.
I didn't get the Hawaiian shirt, the Aloha shirt message. Otherwise, I would have worn mine as well. I have one. Anyway, hey, it's great to be back with everybody here on the last episode of our collaboration of Accented with the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Museum. You know, we over the last couple of months, we've just seen such an incredible range of Vietnamese and diasporic and Southeast Asian writers and artists on this series. I'm so proud to be able to have, along with Philip and DJ Puzzle and everyone else with DVAN, be able to bring you all these incredible writers and artists. You know, we need to take a break after this, though, because I think we're all kind of exhausted. We've done more than our usual allotment of shows. And of course, pandemic is hopefully, at least in the United States, kind of winding down, and summer's almost here. And so I don't know about you, but I actually will be going on vacation for a little bit of time. But meanwhile, we are here with another incredible episode with some really amazing writers, both from Canada and the United States, writing in English and French, and not just writing, but drawing as well. So it's a really incredible assortment, and hopefully we'll be able to wrap up some of the themes that we've been talking about over the last couple months on diasporic writing and diasporic art. So let me introduce the first of our guests to you tonight. It is the cartoonist Thi Bui, who is the author of the graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do, which won an American Book Award. And she's also the illustrator of A Different Pond, written by the poet Bao Phi, which won a Caldecott honor. And with her son Nguyen, she co-illustrated the children's book, Chicken of the Sea, written by me and my son Ellison. Let's give it up for Thi Bui.
Who can you walk? MIA. I'm organic.
Like a tree without a ribbon strip.
All right. Welcome, T.
Hey, Viet. Thanks.
Where are you calling from?
I'm in Oakland, California.
All right. You have one of the best backgrounds. It just looks, I don't know, it's like Banksy illustrated it or something.
Oh, thank you. No, I did this.
Yeah, but it's awesome. So that's why I'm so glad to have you back on board. We have so much to talk about. You're a resident cartoonist. It was great to collaborate with you. And the next person we're going to bring on board is someone who I am also a great admirer of, and I had the chance to talk to him in Toronto. This is Vincent Lam, who is a doctor. So he's going to make us all feel bad because he's not only a novelist, but he's also a doctor. And he's the author of Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures and the novel The Headmaster's Wager, which was shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award and the Commonwealth Prize. And I believe Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures won the Giller Prize in Canada. His next novel, and you're the first people to hear the title of his next novel, but his next novel is Double Blind, and it'll be published in 2022. Give it up for Vincent Lam.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly all your life. You were
All right,
only
Vincent.
waiting.
Thanks. Welcome. You're coming from Toronto. Is that right? Did you save lives today? You know, because I know you're working on addiction medicine and you helped with the vaccine rollout in Canada. Did you just make us feel worse? Did you save lives today? Muted.
Oh, you're muted, Vincent. You might need to unmute.
I would say that statistically speaking, I did save lives. I spent the day vaccinating, and at the site where we vaccinated, we had a target of 400 plus. We got almost 500. So depending on the stats, we saved between 5 and 10 lives.
All right. So I saved no lives today. But the one thing I do want to say is generally, we in America, United States, feel inferior to Canada for a variety of different reasons. But I believe with the vaccine rollout, for once, we're doing better than you guys, at least right now.
Yeah, well, it's a race where we can all win. And I think that's the hope, a global vaccine coverage so that we can all move around freely and get back to normal.
Well, that was a very diplomatic response, much better than mine. Okay.
It's Canadian thing, I say.
All right, our next guest. I'm a great admirer of all our guests tonight. Kim Thuy. I last talked to her in San Francisco. She is the world-renowned author of several books, including Ru, Man, V, and a new book, forthcoming in English translation out in the fall in the United States, M, spelled E-M or Am if you're speaking Vietnamese. Her awards include the Governor General's Literary Award in 2010, and she is one of the top 4 finalists of the Alternative Nobel Prize in 2018. Let's give it up for Kim Thuy.
Quand les hommes vivront d'amour, il n'y aura plus de misère, et commenceront les beaux jours, mais nous serons morts.
Well, welcome.
I just
Thanks
feel
for
like
introducing-
I've chosen the wrong song.
No, I was going to say thanks for introducing a note of classiness to our get together tonight with the French. What was the song? What were we listening to?
Quand les hommes vivront d'amour. So when men will live by love, with love. I don't know how would you translate that, but I think it's the most beautiful song from Quebec. And yeah, so this is better though with the cocktail.
So are you coming to us from Quebec right now?
I'm sorry?
Are you coming to us from Quebec?
Yes, from Montreal.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to talk more about the French language and specifically Quebecois also, but welcome, Kim Thuy. Our final guest is someone if you've been tuning in to AccentediRL, you've seen him before, Eric Nguyen. He earned an MFA in creative writing from McNeese State University in Louisiana. He's the editor-in-chief of Diacritics, which is the blog of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, which publishes first-time writers and established writers. And he is the author of the novel, first-time novelist, the author of the novel, Things We Lost to the Water. Please welcome Eric Nguyen. All right. Eric, how does it feel to be a first-time author now that your novel is out there getting reviews?
It's been exciting. This was released last week and had a lot of good reviews, so it's an exciting time for me.
I would say so. I mean, it's not every first-time novelist who gets a review in the New York Times, and it was a good one by remind me who it was.
Brian Washington.
Brian Washington, who's also a really terrific writer as well. So congratulations on the really incredible rollout for Things We Lost to the Water from Knopf with a cover by Chip Kidd. That I wanted Chip Kidd for my cover designer. So you're living the dream right now, which is fantastic. So it's really awesome to have all of you with us. You represent different genres, different nationalities, different languages, and each in your own ways, you've established a really profound career. Eric, of course, is just at the beginning, and others have published multiple books. But the breadth of what you do allows me to broach the first topic, which is, we have 2 Vietnamese American writers with us, and we have 2 Canadian writers with origins or ancestry in Vietnam. Kim Thuy was born in Vietnam, but Vincent was was born in Canada. It feels like, yes, when you're published, you're born. That's when you really come into existence.
The second birth.
The second birth, exactly. And so, of course, Vietnamese American is well established as a category in the United States. I'm not even sure if Vietnamese Canadian even exists. And so maybe that's the first question for the Canadians. Is Vietnamese Canadian even a thing? And does it mean the same thing or something different in the Canadian context?
Oh, I think I'll have to let Vincent talk about that because, well, in Quebec, it's even, more precise from the French part of Canada. And for now, there are some, I was going to say there are not so many Vietnamese, Quebecers who write. And so basically, I feel like I'm a little bit alone. But we do read from Vietnamese from France, of course, in Quebec. And there are quite a few, as you know.
Right. So actually, in the Quebec situation, and thank you for bringing this, making it even more specific, it's more Francophone. So you have actually more of a, let's say, a literary community with the French writers, right? Okay, that's fantastic to know. So you don't identify, let's say, as a Vietnamese Canadian.
I think, It depends on what they want me to be. And I love to be able to wear different hats. And that's why I get to be invited on different things. Oh, yeah, we're going to invite her as a woman or as a Vietnamese or as a Quebecer, as a Francophone, as a visible minority, all kinds. So I get to be invited so often because of those multiple hats.
Yeah, it's called diversifying your portfolio. So you always have some audience to talk to. So Vincent, as an Anglophone Canadian, does that term Vietnamese Canadian get used? Is that even a term, or is it, or are Vietnamese Americans just really doing their own thing here because of the racial dynamics in the United States?
Yeah, I don't think that I've heard the term Vietnamese Canadian used in conversation ever. Now that I think about it, and I want to be careful that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I don't kind of see it as a cultural entity that I understand very well. We have this funny kind of reverse psychology strategy in Canada in terms of the attitude towards multiculturalism, and I think the reverse psychology strategy is that when people come here, what they're told is, oh, guess what? You're in Canada. You can just continue to be whatever you want. Just continue to be Vietnamese or Chinese or, and the history with Quebec may be slightly different, but but you can be an Indo-Canadian or French-speaking Canadian or whatever it is, and then I think people kind of relax and just say, oh, okay, well, I can be whatever I want. Well, in that case, I want to eat poutine and put maple syrup in my pancakes and drink beer. Exactly. And so I think the issue of hyphenation, it does exist, and racism does exist, but somehow it all kind of is more of an undercurrent rather than an upfront conversation, the way I feel like it is sometimes in America. And there's pluses and minuses to that, honestly. But it does feel like it exists more as this kind of undercurrent.
And I think it's at all levels.
I'm just going to keep on. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, even Canadians, we don't go around saying we're Canadians, much less than Americans say that you are Americans, for example. And so it goes down to everything else, which is more mellow and discreet, I think, Vincent. Right?
Possibly.
Possibly. I mean, like I said, in the United States, we have a lot of fantasies and stereotypes about Canadian exceptionalism. That it's a paradise in Canada. We should all flee north to escape whatever's happening in the United States. But, things happen that remind us, as Vincent alluded to, that things like racism obviously do exist in Canada, and the treatment of certain peoples of color in Canada has often been really atrocious, as a matter of fact, whether we're talking about First Nations or in the case of the Japanese in Canada, their internment experience was actually worse than the internment experience of the Japanese in the Japanese Americans in the United States. But the way that you're talking about the Canadian situation, it is quite different than the United States. And maybe Eric and Thi can speak to this here. We've built an entire literary community around this idea of being Vietnamese American, and it resonates so much with all these other racial dynamics in the United States, African American, Asian American, and so on. But when you hear Vincent and Kim talking about this situation in Canada, do you think that's actually a more attractive situation where the racial dynamics seem to be more flexible, and you could actually just be seen as American before people talk about you as a Vietnamese American, and there may not be a need to organize as we have done here around this Vietnamese American category?
Well, I don't know. I was married to a Canadian for a while. And so when I was in Canada, there were some things I was like, all right, it wasn't a big city. It was a smaller town, and I was talking to older folks, but there was still an Asian market that was called the Oriental Market. And my mother-in-law referred to it as the Oriental Market. So I think I was maybe the first person to tell her to say Asian. And this was 10, 15 years ago. And then the way that people talk about race, I think it's maybe nicer, but it's still racism, even if it's nice. So I don't know. Sometimes I kind of like having a fight about it.
Eric, what do you think?
I mean, like I haven't ever been to Canada. Like I feel like the Canada I know is like just through books. So I don't know if I can speak to comparing the U.S. to Canada, but I feel like in the U.S., like having like a Vietnamese American community, having that as like a label, kind of helped me a lot finding my own identity. And like I feel like that's really useful from an organizing standpoint, especially like when I was in college, organized around like the Vietnamese Student Association or whatnot, and like even the U.S. like Pivot, for example, that really organizes around that identity. So I do see it in a certain extent as a very useful label, especially if we can get a whole bunch of people of some kind of share experience, even if it's kind of assumed in a way, to get on board with something.
So, you know, we've created this category, that is, we as in DVAN, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, has created this category of the Vietnamese diaspora, at least when it comes to the arts and literature, out of this idea that, you know, the consequences of this turbulent 20th century history in Vietnam has produced this diasporic population across dozens of countries, numbering millions of people. And of course, country to country, the experience of the Vietnamese are really, really different for obvious kinds of reasons. So before we get to the most important part of the night, which is talking about our cocktail, let me ask you this, which is, you know, what is the usefulness of this category of the Vietnamese diaspora, or is it not useful at all when it comes to talking about literature? We've brought you all together here, despite all your different backgrounds and your own individual idiosyncrasies, under this idea of the Vietnamese diaspora as a literary experience or literary category. Should we keep going with it? I mean, is it advantageous? You know, or what are some of the possible limitations of this? Okay, Kim, you were shaking your head.
Yeah, I think it's really important, because the first time that I got invited to an event in San Francisco, I was so surprised that there were, you know, so many writers from Vietnam or of Vietnamese origins, and then from then on, I met you know, many French writers as well through Isabelle. And I was surprised that we were quite a few, but not enough, of course, you know, and I think you are there to encourage all of us to continue to write, and to basically archive, you know, these lives, which will be lost soon enough, right? As soon as that generation will disappear. And so I think it is important for you to exist, you know, for you to make us exist as a group, and to have a voice, basically. And it certainly made me felt more anchored, you know, or to see my roots grow because of you. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and you don't have to agree. So it's like, Vincent, what do you think? Again, you don't have to agree. If this is like a limited category, or there are like blind spots that we're not aware of, please tell us.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think that that groups sort of organize in different contexts, you know, and I think if we had been of our parents' generation and we had been, say, in Saigon, we would have felt differently about someone possibly from Hanoi, and we would have really articulated the differences regionally within Vietnam. And of course, in China right now, those differences are articulated and then crushed by the Chinese central government. You know, so this dynamic of differences being created depending on the context, I think, always exists. And then yet, if you go to Canada, you know, a Chinese person becomes a Chinese person, and a Vietnamese person becomes a Vietnamese person, right? So, to me, the organization of groups is kind of one of these things that that depends on the context and the purpose. And you know, I'll tell you a small anecdote that that sadly will shatter any sort of concept of Canadian exceptionalism with regards to some paradise of racial tolerance. So I spent yesterday evening on a Zoom call, because of course everything is Zoom calls, about some racist cyber hate crime that's going on at one of my kids' schools, and one of my children is in a program that is not defined by any sort of Asian ethnicity, and it's just a really elite, publicly funded academic program. And you probably have a sense of where this is going. It just so happens that there end up being a lot of kids who kind of look like the people on this show in that program, and they're from all parts of Asia, right? So, you know, they're kids whose parents have heritage in Korea, Vietnam, China, you know, all over Asia, and so, you know, the people who directed this sort of cyber hate crime stuff towards them didn't bother to distinguish whether they were Vietnamese or Chinese or Korean. That didn't seem to be a material issue. And so in that instance, the organization doesn't really hinge on one's own identity. In a sad way, it ends up hinging on the identity of being a shared target, you know, and so I think everything just depends on context if we're trying to think about whether it's useful or not.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about the debunking Canadian exceptionalism is, of course, the surprise that I learned about when I learned that anti-Asian violence and so on in the COVID era is actually global, and it includes stuff that's happening in Canada. And there was a recent report that Vancouver is one of the hotbeds of anti-Chinese rhetoric and feeling in Canada right now as well. Eric, what do you think? Vietnamese diasporic as a category. Useful? Not useful? Should we retire it?
I think in many ways it has been useful, especially trying to, I guess, like map a particular kind of experience, especially of those who like fled Vietnam after the war. So like I'm thinking of like the early Vietnamese American writers like Lan Cao. She really like put like the narrative of almost like a generation onto like shelves across the country. So I think, yes, in that instance, like it's a very useful category, but like as a writer and as a critic, I'm thinking about like the future of literature and like the future of literature written by people who share my ethnic background. And I'm wondering like how that can be pushed forward. And I really do wonder if speaking about that shared history is that is that enough? Is that pigeonholing us? And like B, if we have other experiences to talk about. So like I really think about like, I mean, we could talk about this later, but like Vietnamese diasporic writers who are of my generation, who are writing like outside of that Vietnamese refugee Vietnamese war experience. And they are really like expanding what it means to be a Vietnamese diasporic person. So I think in that case, the original diasporic definition might not work. It might have to expand it even.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that later when we talk even more specifically about your work. I think you're the youngest of the writers here, and like Vincent, you're born in your case in the United States, and Vincent was born in Canada. So I do want to talk about what it means to have born and to grow up in one of these North American countries, and the impact that has on how you think about yourself and how you think about your writing. But last response before we get to the most important part of the show, the cocktails. Thi, what do you think of this? What we've been talking about?
I really like the word diaspora. It sounds nice for one thing. Like it's got a sense of movement in it that I think is a better way to think about how people are over history, like how a people are over history, right? Like we're never static. Culture isn't static. People aren't static. People have like migrated, to find better lives, to survive for a long time, and everybody does it. So I think like diaspora encompasses like a human experience that I really like. So people outside of the Vietnamese diaspora can understand what it means too, because they have their own diasporas that they come from. And for us, I don't know that it necessarily has to be locked into the refugee experience. I think that was one time of mass migration for us, but there was also the mass migration from the north to the south in the 50s. And then when you talk about Chinese Vietnamese, there's like a diaspora that comes from China from like 1 or 2 or 3 generations before. So I like it. And I think that we continue to move, right? Some of us might move to Canada. Some of us have been threatening to do that. We might not do that anymore under this new administration. I don't know. And then some of us like go to Europe or go back to Vietnam. Like there's this movement that I think is really exciting. And I like that better than writers of Vietnamese origin, because I feel like that one is more locked down. And then you end up trying to figure out how much of your origins are Vietnamese. Whereas diaspora is, you've got the globe.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's like, if you saw my mouth moving as I'm shouting at my son who's trying to break into my office right now. But you brought up the Chinese diaspora, and we're going to return to that after our cocktail break with Vincent. But let's bring on Thi Fan right now, our resident mixologist, and have her introduce the Golden Hour.
Thank you, Viet. I'm really excited to be here tonight to share drinks with everyone and just over the course of the season of Accented. So tonight's drink is called the Golden Hour here. And this is inspired by the tequila sunset or sunrise cocktail. And I thought the sunset sunrise theme would be really fitting for us as we close out this really amazing season of Accented IRL. And I also wanted to create a drink that would get us through the change in seasons from spring to summer and hopefully signaling more good things to come on the horizon with vaccinations rolling out. So keeping my fingers crossed and being hopeful. So in this drink, you can use a liquor base of tequila, mezcal, or rum, whatever you like to drink. It also has mango juice and orange juice and lime juice, just to mellow out that, just to brighten up that mellow, like very sweet mango flavor. And then you can add in lychee sparkling water to give it some more floral notes to the tropical flavors, rounding it all out. And then finally, you'll see at the bottom, the red gradient, that's hibiscus syrup. And then to create this kind of sunrise effect, you just pour the syrup really slowly down the side of your glass. And the hibiscus syrup, you don't have to buy, you can just make it home with hibiscus tea, hot water, and sugar. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it tonight. And cheers to a nice and warm season coming up and better things for us on the horizon. So thank you so much.
These kids are so special. Thanks, Thi.
I don't know what I did wrong, but I did not get the sunrise effect as you and T very clearly got. And I tried to pour the hibiscus syrup slowly down the side of the glass, and it just didn't work.
You just need more practice, more drinks.
Okay. I just need to fly you out to California so you can make me the drink yourself. All right. Thank you so much, Thi. It's delicious. And let's go back to this question of diasporas and talk Vincent. You know, Vincent, your heritage is ethnic Chinese from Vietnam, even though you were born in Canada. And the history of the ethnic Chinese in Vietnam is obviously a very complicated one because of Chinese colonization a long time ago, but then now in the 20th century, the presence of a very substantial Chinese population in Vietnam. And I wonder, in your own thinking, your own experience, do the ethnic Chinese in Vietnam, do they call themselves Vietnamese or Chinese? Should they be treated as Vietnamese or Chinese? And how have they sought to represent themselves? And one of the reasons why this is of tremendous curiosity for me is because I think Vietnam as a whole has had a troubled relationship with the ethnic Chinese, particularly in the years of the war and afterwards. And something that T has said before, which I think is relevant here, is that she has foregrounded the fact that we need to talk about the ethnic majority in Vietnam, not just the ethnic minority. And the ethnic majority are the kin people like me and T. T, you've characterized us as the white people of Southeast Asia. I think that's a fair characterization.
You're gonna get me in trouble on Twitter again.
You got in trouble on Twitter for that? Okay.
Yes.
Why?
I don't really want to get into it, but it was surprising. Yeah, some people were not ready to go there.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that on another episode. But from my perspective, there are definitely majority-minority relations within Vietnam, and the place of the ethnic Chinese, as I said, has been a potentially challenging one. So let me know what you think, Vincent, about this question of being ethnic Chinese from Vietnam.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, so that is how I think of myself and characterize myself as someone from the expatriate Chinese community of Vietnam. And I think I kind of got there simply through a question of what would be most clear and avoid confusion, because I felt that if people would ask in that sort of weird way that people sometimes ask, oh, where are you from? And I would say, oh, well, I was born in London, Ontario, which is a pretty quiet place in Canada. Then they would say, oh, no, but where are you really from? And I would say, no, I was born in London, Ontario. And they would say, okay, well, where are your parents born? And I would say, okay, Vietnam. Oh, so you're Vietnamese. I said, well, not exactly. So like all these little dances were so complicated and tiring that I just found it more simple to say, look, I'm from the Chinese community of Vietnam. And I think the question of how a majority people treat a minority people kind of ends up really defining countries and really defines not only the relations between those people, but defines, I think, a lot of forces and a lot of dynamics within the country. And I mean, we see that all over. We see that right now in Israel/Palestine, which I think is the best way to refer to that part of the world. We see that in mainland China, the attempt by a large majority population to really kind of homogenize a minority population. And I think the narrative of homogeneity is one that's so tremendously appealing at this really simple level. And of course, that drives lots of right-wing politics in many parts of the world, Canada and America included. So I think, to me, that's one of the really kind of interesting things that sometimes gets lost in the discussion. When the discussion is just, okay, so how does a majority group treat a minority group? It kind of also misses a central dynamic, which is a conflictive narrative. Ultimately is this kind of reductionistic narrative, and almost always plays to kind of a focused vision of what a particular country is. We are a certain people and this is us. And unfortunately, that's often not true, and it often really lacks a great deal of richness and nuance and awareness of history. So I think it's kind of sad when that kind of dyadic relationship exists.
Well, I think your answer suggests that, that these national categories of Vietnamese and Chinese and other national categories are oftentimes not sufficient, because in your particular situation, being Vietnamese is not sufficient since you're ethnic Chinese from Vietnam, and being Chinese is not sufficient because your ancestry is not from China, for example. Yes. And so we need these sort of fine-grained nuances, and that's partly what we've been talking about on the show in previous episodes, talking about how other ethnic minority populations in Vietnam and complicating this notion of what being Vietnamese is. So I just want to know, like, are we the white people of Asia? I mean, have Vietnamese people, ethnic Nguyen majority Vietnamese people, treated ethnic Chinese Vietnamese people in ways that analogous ways to how white supremacists have treated minorities here in North America?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but it's funny the way that ends up playing out, right? So there's a tiny episode of my novel, and everything else is made up, but it turns on something that happened to my father, which is that he refused to learn Vietnamese in school at one point in Chulun, which was part of Saigon, is now just Saigon. And at one point, the Vietnamese government said, "No, you have to go and learn Vietnamese," and he refused to do that, and he got in trouble, and it was a problem. And I'm not really sure what the point was, because he spoke at least some Vietnamese in any case, but he refused. And so I think that that was youthful rebellion or whatever. And then years later, when he was here in Canada, he told me about this, and he said, "Oh, well, I was really wrong." He said, I really should have gone and we would live there and not speak Vietnamese. That doesn't make any sense at all. So I guess, the thing that I came away from that with is that, it's difficult to force people to do things, and it's usually not effective, right? It's far better to compel people to engage in ways that are compelling, not in ways that are coercive. And
one of the ironies, of course, is that the
Canadian, that's I can hear my Canadian coming out, and I just think, oh my God.
Well, I think the question of coercion is important because Vietnamese have been coerced as a whole, throughout their history by various other powers, and yet they're within the country of Vietnam. The ethnic Nguyen majority have obviously done their fair share of coercion as well. And the question of language is really interesting to me because in Vietnam, I'm sure there is Chinese language writing by ethnic Chinese in Vietnam. Here in the United States, there is Vietnamese language writing by Vietnamese Americans, and then there's English language writing by Vietnamese Americans, and at least from what I know about the Vietnamese American context, what the Vietnamese Americans writing in Vietnamese versus what the Vietnamese Americans writing in English are writing is really actually quite different, because they express different kinds of linguistic orientations, but also different kinds of historical experiences given why they're writing in English or in Vietnamese. So this brings me back to Kim, because you're writing in French. And I'm learning French, and I know my French is really terrible because neither you or Vincent complimented me on my French in the green room when I dared to say something. So thank you for discouraging me. But French is an interesting language because French is obviously an imperial language. In the 19th century, everybody had to learn French. Now, French is still an important language, but it's not an imperial language anymore. It's a post-imperial language. I've seen France described as a middling power, right? Which must really irritate the French to be described in that fashion. So it's a really interesting language to write in the sense that it has this imperial legacy, maybe an imperial hangover, and yet it's not a global language anymore, even though it's spoken in many countries. And you're coming from this perspective of being in Quebec and with having Quebecois, and then Canada being partly a francophone country, and partly has a legacy of French colonization in Canada. So many layers. And then, of course, you're from Vietnam. You were born in Vietnam, and French there obviously was a language that our parents and grandparents had to know, but not really necessarily our generation and the generation now. French is not even really a favored language in Vietnam anymore. So many interesting layers for you when it comes to French. So take us through what that means for you to have chosen to write in French, and what these different layers of reference might be for you.
It's so particular because you were talking about coercion, to force people to learn a language, and in Quebec, because French, we are surrounded by Americans, right, and by English Canadians, so we always feel that our French here in Quebec is threatened and it can disappear at any time. So there are laws, there are, all immigrants who come in, we're forced to go to French school, unless you can prove that your parents are English speaking, or they went to school in English, then you can go to an English school. Otherwise, all immigrants have to go to a French speaking school, and so there's a whole generation of Vietnamese speaking French because of that law. But because of course, as humans, we're lazy. We would choose the most obvious and the easiest way, to speak or to communicate. So everybody would choose English, even when you live here in Quebec. And there's a big community, English-speaking community, who refuse to speak French or to learn French even while they're living here. So French, even though it was, Quebec was a colony of France or whatever, we still feel that now it has become our identity. And the French spoken in Quebec is very particular, right? And so we fight very hard to keep that language. In my personal experience. French is not just a language. It was the people who welcomed us when we arrived here, and it was such an important moment in my life when they opened their arms and literally physically picked me up in there, and held me in their arms. Those first people who did that in Quebec when we first arrived spoke French, spoke French from Quebec. And so I fell in love with those people. So I cannot, how would I say it? I was not forced to learn French because I fell in love with them. So I want to learn that language, right? Like when you fall in love with an Italian, you want to learn Italian. Well, anyway, that's another story. But right, you want to embrace that culture. You want to get into the other person's culture, and that's how I fell into French. And I didn't know that I was forced to learn French. And after that, when I write, I don't know, my only mission in life is to share beauty. And when I write, it's really only about, beauty. And so I cannot use a different language than French because that's the language of love, that the language that gave me my second chance, my second life. So I associate, I would say, French to that moment. So it's very precise. It's not the French from Vietnam because it's so different, and it's not the French from France. So there's almost like so. Fortunately, it's basically detached from all those histories, and it becomes only my own story, my own love story with that language. And also, you should learn French just for 2 words. The first one is gourmand and gourmandise, which doesn't exist in English because, gourmand and gourmandise means that you eat, but, with guilt, but so much pleasure, right? And in the English language, you only have gluttony, which is like only guilt. There's no pleasure in that, right? But gourmandise, that second piece of chocolate cake is gourmandise. So please learn French, just that word. And then the second word that the English language doesn't have is jouissance. And you know that word, right? Jouissance. It's not pleasure. It's a lot more than pleasure, but it's not euphoria. It's not. It's I don't know how. And it's not orgasm because orgasm is very short and striking and sudden and all of that. But jouissance is so much more. Longer. It's ample.
There's a sense of joy to it.
I'm sorry?
I mean, there's a sense of joy and delight and discovery in it.
Yeah, and so it's so beautiful, and it's mostly because it's longer. So so I don't understand why the English language doesn't have a word for that sensation, right? So that's why you should learn French. That's the only reason.
Well, I encountered jouissance through Roland Barthes as a graduate student. So the way that I encountered it was through this very high-minded intellectual context, right? But one way that jouissance has been translated into English is bliss. And for Roland Barthes, I mean, he was like, well, sometimes it's boredom, so some people, don't want to be bored, but for someone as esoteric as Roland Barthes, this French philosopher, like boredom was actually a side of jouissance as well. And I relate to that because sometimes, when I'm watching, French movies, for example, I'm in a state of jouissance, but then people who are not in love with French culture could be totally bored. Like this French stuff is so boring. They have a totally different aesthetic than what we have here in lowbrow American culture. But but my last question for you related to language is, when I write in English, besides the question of art and beauty and everything, for me, there's also a political and a combative element to it, which is that I think, as Vincent has already alluded to, those of us who appear Asian, no matter if we're born here or not or have citizenship, oftentimes we're regarded as being not of this particular North American country, whether it's Canada or the United States. And a lot of that has to do with language, the stereotypical perception that people who look Asian don't speak the language well, whether it's English or French. So in my case, I wanted to master English as a way of demonstrating that I belong to this country, to this language. And if I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be a better writer than a lot of other writers writing in English, as a way of, again, of demonstrating not just might be belonging to the country, but to the literature. Like, you know, this is, if I could be a better writer than 99% of other writers writing in English, then I've done my job. So I'm wondering, you know, if that was true for you writing in French. And also, you know, when I write in English, it gives me access to an Anglophone world. So here we're talking about the UK, but also Western European countries that have been impacted by American, you know, pop culture and American imperialism. So I'm wondering if in the Francophone world, whether, you know, there's a similar kind of parallel where you're being read in Francophone countries, like in North Africa, West Africa, for example.
Well, not. I'm sorry. You said Africa or America?
Africa, you know, like the French Francophone, all the sphere that the French impacted through their imperialism.
I think, you know, of course, we can, you know, go back into history and say maybe we should, you know, we should look at French from that angle, or we can strive from there, in the sense that I think in this very complex world right now, I think the Francophone countries can play a different role, and it's less political. Today, you know, because we don't have the same power than the English-speaking countries, or to name the U.S. And so I think it does play. You know, we still, I think, associate French language with culture, and I think it's important almost to, you know, to have that francophonie to exist and to insist on culture. Yes, we have this common language, but at the same time, the French language is spoken very differently from one country to the next, and it does carry the history of each country. And in Haiti, for example, you have le Creole, right, where you can, it carries the history of that country, the hurt and all the you know, the fusion, the mixture. And even in the Vietnamese language, right, we have so many words in French embedded into the language, and it shows, I think, the history of our country, what we have survived and what we have what we have won over. I think, you know, to yes, the French was there, but then they had to leave, you know, at one point, because we didn't want them to continue to be there, and we did get them to leave the country. So in a way, yes, I look at it as if, yes, you did try to get into you know, and French did try to exist in all these countries, but after many fights, and after the strength of all, you know, of national identities, it left. And I think we should not erase that. It's almost like how do you say that? Les cicatrices de guerre, you know, the scars of the warriors, right? There's just, I don't know. In my case, I carry it as a war scar, and I'm proud of that, you know, and today I fight for francophonie just because I think we insist more on culture, to share culture, than to have to impose ourselves politically. So I think it's important to have the francophonie to continue to flourish, and to have a certain collaboration among us.
All right. Speaking of francophonie, let's turn to Eric, because you know your first novel, Things We Lost to the Water, is set in Louisiana, with its francophone heritage, and so I was so struck by reading your novel that it deals with an element of the Vietnamese experience that people are aware of but haven't really talked about that much, which is the existence of this entire Vietnamese community in Louisiana that migrated there after 1975. And of course, Robert Olen Butler did talk about that in his book, Good Scent from a Strange Mountain. And we've been waiting, you know, also to hear from the Vietnamese Americans themselves. So tell us about the origins of this novel, and tell us a little bit about the novel as well, Eric.
Okay, so the novel is about a family of Vietnamese refugees who flee in 1978 from Vietnam, but only the mother and her sons make it to the U.S., and they find themselves in New Orleans. New Orleans has this smallish compared to other places like San Jose or Houston. Community of Vietnamese people, and they're mostly in the eastern part of the city, which is, I guess, away from the city, even though it's within city limits. And they really built a community there, a small community around mostly a church down there. But since like after their first arrival, generations have like grown up and moved to other parts of the city. So my novel really looks into the particular experience of this family within that community, and how they adjust to their new environment. So I guess this novel was written because I went to school in Louisiana, Lake Charles, which is about 3 hours or so away from New Orleans. And during my time in grad school, I learned more about the community there, and I felt like it was a very interesting story. It was different from my own family's story, and I felt that it was also the same in some ways. So I just ran with it in a way. What was the part of the question?
Well, I visited New Orleans and was struck by the existence of the Vietnamese American community there. And of course, I'm from San Jose, and for Vietnamese people, California, at least for the North American diaspora, I think California is the heart of the diaspora, especially San Jose and Orange County. And so many stories have been told about these the Californian population. What do you think makes the life of the Vietnamese Americans in Louisiana different than the ones in California who have dominated the national conversation?
I think there's, from what I've seen, like there's a more cohesiveness in there. I feel like it's such a really small community compared to like other communities in New Orleans, that they really stick together. And like again, like the church is really like their like cornerstone, you could say, or like the center of their community. And like the church is like involved with like so many community growth, development kind of stuff down there, that they kind of just gravitates towards it even now, at least from the last time I was in New Orleans. So that's, I feel, is one difference. But I also feel that there's like a Southern pride to them. I feel like a lot of Asian Americans are left out of the Southern U.S. story, and I feel like they kind of inhabit that space of being Southern and being Asian Americans. They experience like the racism that people would, like Vietnamese Americans would experience elsewhere, but I feel like they kind of take it more, I wouldn't say more easily, but they see themselves as equally as Southerners as Vietnamese in a way. I might be mistaken that, but like that's my experience. Like talking to them, they're really prideful of their place in New Orleans, and I feel like going to other communities, like there's not that sense of pride in place. Like I grew up in Maryland, the DC, Maryland area, and we had a small community of Vietnamese people here too, but there wasn't that pride of, hey, I'm from DC. And a lot of the Vietnamese people like I grew up with kind of moved away, and like they weren't really like tethered to their city as like many Vietnamese in New Orleans are. Like Vietnamese in New Orleans, some have left the city, especially after Hurricane Katrina, but a lot have stayed and have contributed to the community there. So I feel like there's definitely a different feel to their community. There's a more homey feel, almost like they made a home here, and like they intend to stay, compared to like other places where I feel like it's more easy to leave, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think the homey and then the implied humility and humbleness part is interesting because, of course, the other big, Southern American population of Vietnamese Americans is in Houston. I don't think I'm going to offend some Houstonians here. I don't think they have a reputation for being humble in Houston, at least with the House of Ho TV show that we have. Now, your novel, and this will be the last question for you, but your novel, deals with Hurricane Katrina. And so you have refugees who have come to the United States and then they become displaced again during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I remember when Hurricane Katrina happened, that President George Bush at the time said, okay, well, first of all, some of the American media called these displaced people refugees. And President George Bush at the time said, it's un-American to call these people refugees. And a lot of them who were displaced were Black. And Jesse Jackson, for I think the only time in history, agreed with George Bush. And he said, it's racist to call African Americans refugees. And I thought that was so interesting that, like we who are Vietnamese refugees who have lived through this experience are now being categorized in such a way that we are somehow completely outside of the Black and white American dynamic. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that. Like if we were to embrace our refugee identity and experience, not just our Vietnamese identity and experience, if we were to embrace our refugee identity and experience, are we somehow going to be perpetually stateless people in the national imagination of the United States and many other countries? I don't think the United States is the only country that thinks of refugees in this fashion.
I think in a lot of ways, like at least in the American context, Americans don't know what to do with refugees. Like given like even like refugees today, like there's this dialogue of like, should we let them in? Should we not let them in? There's compared that to like immigrants, where they seem like they're more welcome in a way because America is like this country of immigrants. So like, of course there'll be immigrants, but like the figure of the refugee is like something that Americans don't seem to want. They don't like the idea of people fleeing, especially if it's kind of their fault that they're fleeing. So I feel like that's something refugees, Vietnamese American refugees, like have to deal with, even if they settle like there are Vietnamese refugees or from that diaspora who like now call themselves like former refugees. So I feel like there is kind of that shame in a way that you don't want to be a refugee, but I feel like saying that you are a refugee, that you come from a refugee experience can be a very powerful thing, especially if we're talking about how the conversation in present days is about refugees and how we as Americans deal with them. So I feel like when people talk about my novel, when they say it's a novel about Vietnamese immigrant, I try to correct them and say, they're refugees. And I feel like that's really important to just have that kind of exposure, to have that part of the conversation, because like we're not just a nation of immigrants, but a nation of just people who move. I think it was Thi who said that the human experience is just a diaspora. I feel like to call ourselves or our experience like refugee, I feel like that kind of goes along with that diaspora category, that people are just moving all the time, even within the U.S. And like people from Hurricane Katrina, I would call them refugees, especially if they left and like they flee that storm and like never came back, built new lives. So like their experience were like similar to like refugees coming from outside the country.
Yeah,
I think in a domestic context, you would call Americans who are displaced by the hurricane internally displaced people, right? That would be like the category that NGOs would use to describe them. So maybe it probably is racist to call like Black Americans refugees because they're in their own country being displaced. But I think then again, so are Vietnamese Americans who had lived there for a while, who are displaced by Hurricane Katrina. And I think that was the issue that I've heard from people who worked with Boat People SOS at the time, was that people actually said to Vietnamese American shrimpers and fishermen who were trying to like make claims about like damages done to their boats during the hurricane, that like you can only have one crisis. So you already had your Boat People crisis, and so you can't get counted here. So I think that's where the Vietnamese were really disadvantaged in that situation. But I think to Eric's point, there is a really similar experience of being displaced, right?
Yeah. Well, you're right. If you go to the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission on Refugees website, there's a whole set of categories about talking about displaced people. So refugees are actually only one subset of a larger category that UNHCR calls forcibly displaced people. And the technical definition of a refugee is someone forced to move from one country to another country. So I guess if you use those categorizations, that yes, technically it's wrong to call internally displaced people refugees. But I'm also of the mindset that if they look like a refugee and they smell like a refugee, then we should probably call them refugees. And like to be offended by the categorization of people as refugees is what I find interesting. Like, why is it un-American to be a refugee? As in, Americans can never be refugees. Americans can never be forced to leave. That speaks to this idea of American exceptionalism, that we could never be like Vietnam or any other, Haiti or other countries like that. And it's racist to call Americans refugees. Like, that's somehow demeaning to be a refugee. That's what I find problematic. Like as Eric said, I take pride in being a refugee. I don't think it's racist to be considered a refugee. So, and the last thing I'll say about Eric's point is Eric, as our former president, who hopefully will go forever unnamed, as he said, I don't like losers. And that probably is expressing a whole sentiment that many Americans embrace. We don't like being losers, and you refugees are losers. Vincent, you wanted to jump in before I get to Thi.
And that's actually very much my observation, that the word refugee contains the word refuge. So if you leave aside the exact political definitions, it has the word refuge, which implies that someone needs something. And so, if you equate the concept of someone needing something, someone needing help from someone else, with that person being a loser, and if the myth of nation to which one subscribes is that it's a nation of winners and a nation of really strong, independent people who don't need help from anyone else, then the concept of someone who needs refuge, who needs help from someone else, is inherently really unappealing. And so that's what we get from that to racism, right? But two observations. So I'm married to a Cypriot, and Cyprus was invaded by Turkey, long, complicated history. So, everyone acknowledges that there's an illegal occupation. Everyone except Turkey acknowledges there's an illegal occupation of the northern half of Cyprus by Turkey. But people who are from the north are called refugees within Cyprus. And that's not a derogatory term. That's a term which has all kinds of significance. It means they're deserving of assistance. It means that you should be kind to these people. You should help these people, right? And, a really interesting kind of twist on this. So in Canada, and I want to be really careful, I feel like we're riffing off the Canadian exceptionalism. I always want to poke that bubble as well, because we think a little bit too much of ourselves sometimes. But we do have this really interesting program, which is called this private sponsorship program. So what it means is that if there's something going on in the world and there are refugees, then a group of people can come together and say, okay, well, we want to sponsor these people. We'll raise the money, and we take it upon ourselves to support them financially for a period of time, for about a year, and get them on their feet. And so some friends of mine who were both Vietnamese boat people and were both refugees when they came to Canada, and came here separately and met and married and so on. So they and our family and a few other families got together and sponsored a Syrian refugee family. And I remember at that time, when this was happening, it was almost kind of there was an aspect of social status to it, right? You sort of didn't want to be in the progressive family that wasn't somehow involved in sponsoring a Syrian refugee family, and there was a little bit of a sort of virtue signaling, as it were, in doing that. And I don't want to overstate this, because the truth is that Europe takes far more refugees than we do in Canada. Our numbers are really comparatively tiny. But it's interesting, because the way you frame what a refugee is really changes the meaning of that. So if you view a refugee as someone weak and needing assistance, and that's not part of the national myth, then that's totally undesirable, right? Whereas if you frame your national myth, and there's definitely aspects of myth making, right? But if you frame your national myth in terms of we are a people who welcome and who take other people unto us, then suddenly the embrace of refugees becomes virtuous. So I think so much depends on the narrative.
Right. And, Thi, on that question of refugees and narrative, obviously the best we could do is focused on the Vietnamese refugee experience. But in the aftermath of the success of the book, you've also turned in other directions as well. You've talked a lot more about prisoners, deportees, and refugees in general, including going to Greece a couple of summers ago to look at the refugee experiences there. And I'm wondering, is that turn towards these other populations of prisoners and deportees and refugees in general an outcome of your own thinking about what the Vietnamese refugees had been through?
Yeah, definitely going to Lesbos, Greece, to interview refugees with my best friend from high school, who is a refugee from Afghanistan from a long time ago. We both, that's how we introduced ourselves to people. We said we were refugees as small children, and UNHCR helped us. We're not here with any NGOs, but UNHCR is letting us into this camp to interview you, and we just want to use our perspective to help you tell your story to whoever you want to tell it to. And most of the people who were in the camp at that point were no longer Syrian. They were from Afghanistan originally, but some of them had lived in Iran for a while, or Turkey. So it was really emotional for both of us, for her especially, but for me also, because I knew some of this stuff, but I hadn't been to a refugee camp since I lived in one as a small child. So I think it would have really added another dimension to the best we could do had I done that experience while writing that book, because it really gave me empathy for the experience of the parents going through that. And all the things that they did to protect their children, and all of the mundaneness of like just waiting, being in limbo in this space that's not ideal, and you don't know where you're going to go, and you're just waiting for other countries to accept you.
You raised the issue of empathy, and of course, one of the things that drives me crazy is the lack of empathy that some refugees have exhibited towards other refugees. I think specifically of Vietnamese refugees, former refugees, who have said, "Oh, we're the good refugees.
Right.
These new people are the bad refugees."
Yeah, that sort of refugee exceptionalism is actually why I say the shit I do about like what Vietnamese people being the white people of Southeast Asia. I'm actually like specifically pushing against that narrative of like, we are the exceptional refugees because somehow we were special and the US owes us and all of that. So that's me trying to like push against Vietnamese in really specific moments of like abundance. We don't have a lot, but when we do, I like to try to remind us to like extend our table, to invite others in. So
and I think that's one of the when we started off this conversation talking about maybe some of the limitations of the category of being Vietnamese diaspora, and let's end with this right before we go to the break. We'll go to the break in just a couple of minutes, and those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please send them to us. After the break, Philip's going to take over, and we'll hear from you with your questions for Vincent, for Kim, for Eric, and for Thi. But the last question, Thi, for you before the break is, when it comes to this category of being Vietnamese, it's obviously very powerful. I think we need it. We can form community and self-defense and things like that. But as you're saying, it can also be a way for people to hang on to their own exceptionalism and focus not on this general idea of empathy, but to focus on their own pain. So Vietnamese people are always willing to talk about their own pain. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be empathetic with other people's pain, which I find to be totally ironic. So your turn in your recent work towards talking about prisoners and deportees and other refugees besides the Vietnamese people, do you think that's one of the ways by which we can take our Vietnamese experiences and get away from our focus upon the past, which is one of the debilitating aspects of the Vietnamese diasporic experience?
Yes and no. The thing is, when you talk about deportation, it still goes back to the wars in Southeast Asia. That violence like set up the violence that people experienced when they were resettled in the U.S. and that led to the conditions that led to their imprisonment and being in trouble with the law in the U.S. So it still goes back to the war. But for me personally, it was just a way to take some of the focus off of myself, because I realized that I was like getting invited to do a lot of talks, and I realized that I could really get pigeonholed as an exceptional minority or a refugee success story. And I really didn't want to be the model minority, because I saw the long shadow that casts on people who don't fit that mold. And also, I was just getting a lot of people tweeting I was getting a lawyer from the Asian Law Caucus tweeting at me to actually highlight some of the deportation cases. And I didn't know anything about how to stop deportation at the time, but I read really fast. And the more that I read, the madder I got. So one small project led to another project, which led me to then convince my publisher to let me change the entire topic of my book from something very different to now deportation.
Yeah, I think it's so crucial. Again, the category of the being diasporic and being Vietnamese has enabled so many things. It could shut down other things as well. We need other kinds of vocabulary that allows us to connect to other histories, other populations, whether it's deportation or in my case, I think increasingly about decolonization instead of simply talking about race or identity as a way of connecting the Vietnamese experience to other kinds of populations who have been colonized as well. So thank you all for this really rich conversation. There's still actually more stuff to talk about, which we resume after the break. But Philip, come on back here and tell us what we can expect over the next few minutes.
All right. Thank you all so much for this, really insightful conversation. Just to give everyone who's with us now a kind of lay of the land. We're going to be ending a little bit late. And, as we're talking about this idea of Vietnameseness and being refugees, I'm reminded of this phrase that my dad would always use. Just tự nhiên như người tị nạn, right? Tự nhiên như người tị nạn. Just go as you go, we've already gone through so much, and it's where we continue to go through more. And, it's almost as it reminds me of a, live in the moment, live for the day, kind of vibe, kind of phrase. And that's kind of how we're going with tonight, the end of our Accented IRL series, our season finale. I'm going to pass it over to DJ Puzzle to take us into a cocktail break so y'all can get some refills on those drinks, because I know y'all need some, as I do as well. We're going to come back. Hopefully by the time that we come back, you've left some comments, some questions in our comment section for us to ask the guests that we have on for today. And maybe the guests have questions for each other. We can get into a little bit of that. But until then, we'll come back in about 6 minutes at 7 p.m. PST, 10 EST. So I'll pass it to DJ Puzzle to take us away.
Temptation it's wrong, alright. It makes you do what you love. He knows it can't be fixed. Ooh, it's perfect mix. He looks in my eyes. I feel like I've been hypnotized. I've wanted him for so long, and what I thought was all so strong. Times feel exchange, you and I. Ease your mind, 'cause I don't need to hurt you. It's just he knows to treat me like a special lady. It's how you look away. He knows just how to touch me. Maybe someday you'll understand. She's a part of life. It doesn't matter if it's wrong or right. Sensation. She's a part of life. It doesn't matter if it's wrong or right. Sensation. She's a part of life. It doesn't matter if it's wrong or right. Sensation. She's a part of life. It doesn't matter if it's wrong or right.
Every situation, moving through the doorway of the nation. Pick me up and check it out, baby. I can't do without. Don't mess around, you bring me down. How you get about? Don't make sense. Slow down. I remember only for an hour. Move right through me, can you feel the power? I don't know what's going on, scared to be wrong belong. Don't mess around, you bring me down. How you get about, don't make sense, move out. Move out, move out, move out, move out, move out, move out. Now he's in control, he's my lover. Nation stand against him, he's your brother. Been a long time now. I'll get to you somehow.
Thank you so much, DJ Puzzle, for fading out and fading me back in, and for that the incredible musical stylings during the cocktail break. As we said at the beginning of the show, after this show, we're gonna go on a bit of a break. One of the projects that we have going on that we're going to be releasing during that break through the summer, so that y'all have some tunes to jam and vibe to during your summer post-pandemic wanderings, is a playlist, mixtapes by DJ Puzzle, that we'll be posting on our DVAN SoundCloud. So stay tuned for those, because those are going to be really exciting. I'm also here to make a quick plug, and I want to direct y'all to the DVAN website, dvan.org. Again, we want to thank Smithsonian APA, the APA Center, for co-sponsoring this series, Accented IRL, with us. If y'all are interested in learning more about the Smithsonian, please visit Smithsonian APA on Instagram, Facebook, all socials. If you're interested in learning more about DVAN, please visit this dvan.org website, where you can find everything about DVAN. The Diacritics blog, where we oftentimes, on the Accented show, we feature a book spotlight. Tonight's book spotlight is Eric Nguyen's Things We Lost to the Water, and we've been listening to Eric talk about his book and his conceptualization of this family, this Vietnamese refugee family in New Orleans, which is also available from our bookstore partner, Eastwind Books of Berkeley, at asiabookcenter.com for a discounted rate right now. So go and check them out. I also want to direct y'all to the members section of DVAN, which is new. DVAN, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, as we were talking at the beginning of how we've conceptualized this literary landscape from from being Diasporic Vietnamese, right? We've created this virtual home for folks who might want to become members of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network and be connected to other folks who are doing this work and sharing and showcasing their art, as well as folks who are, it's meant to be a space, and maybe Viet can talk a little bit more about this and the motivations for how DVAN came to be and how it really has become this place where up-and-coming writers as well as veteran writers have been able to mix and mingle with each other and really push the boundaries and limitations of what it means to be a refugee and what it means to be Vietnamese and what it means to be diasporic, right? And maybe actually I'll bring on Viet right now. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that, Viet, as we mentioned the DVAN membership pages. And what your initial motivation was for, co-founding DVAN at the beginning. As we're coming to this really important moment where we're, I think, soon going to be shifting from virtual events back into, the public literary events where we're in person and sharing our work and art.
Yeah, I think in-person events will be so much more fun when we can drink in person versus drinking online, right? For those of us who drink. But, even as our conversation tonight has shown, one of the important reasons why we didn't just make a Vietnamese American arts organization is because there's so many differences in the diaspora between different communities, whether we're talking about national communities like Canadian or American or French, or even more specific kinds of categories like ethnic Chinese or Gin majority or other kinds of ethnic minorities that we've had here on the show, including the Harai people, for example. So many different kinds of variations. And the ability to compare, contrast, to move between these different categories is really, I think, empowering, because number one, it allows us to form a larger diasporic community versus a national community, and because it means that each of us has to be aware of our own assumptions, our own nationalisms, our own ethnocentrisms. And that's one of the productive things about having a diaspora that allows us to make these different connections, as we've been talking about. So yeah, we formed Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network out of this impulse to create an artistic community for diasporic Vietnamese people, because at least when we were first thinking about this in the 1990s, the entire emphasis in the Vietnamese community was on survival. Everybody was saying, oh, you got to go to law school or medical school or become an engineer and so on. And this was where all the emphasis was being put, understandably so. But in the age of anti-Asian violence, I hope it's become increasingly clear that as important as doctors and lawyers and engineers are, they're not going to save us from anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian rhetoric. That's what we need our artists, our activists, our storytellers for, because our job is to deal with images, with narratives, with words, and there we can contest how we're being misrepresented or mischaracterized and tell our own stories and form new communities. So hopefully, whatever country we're talking about, we have reached a recognition that the issue of material survival has been taken care of to a certain extent, at least enough, so that we can start to worry about other kinds of important things, such as stories and culture and art, which in my opinion are as equal as the material things for our survival and for our sustenance. And so that's why, it's my real pleasure and privilege to, invite so many different people on the show, have a chance to talk to them and hear about their thinking, and and form this kind of virtual and real community as well. So I know we have a question or two from the audience, Philip. Do you want to? But before we get there, I think Kim had something to say about the last topic of conversation we were talking about, specifically in terms of inclusion, belonging, politics, and Quebec, and all of these kinds of complicated issues around what we've been dealing with.
I'll take you back in the 80s, 1980s, when Quebec wanted to separate itself from the rest of Canada, and we arrived in '79. So we were we arrived in the midst of this dispute, basically between the French Canadian and the English Canadian, or Quebec and the rest of Canada. But we were so new, we were newcomers. We just arrived, so we didn't understand what was happening. But then in '95, the issue was discussed again. Should we separate ourselves from the rest of Canada, and so on and so forth. and the referendum was for us to stay within Canada. And I remember the Prime Minister in Quebec who was leading this question. He went to the microphone on that night to announce that he lost, basically, and then he said that, Quebec women don't make enough children, that's why we don't have enough votes for this referendum, and so on and so forth. And for me, being raised as a French-speaking immigrant, I was so offended, that you have you as if you have adopted this child, but then when there's an important issue, then we were no longer part of the conversation, right? And so, yes, this is a great country, but yes, from time to time there are issues where refugees are still not included in the conversation, and because and Vic, you mentioned stateless, and in those moments, of course, we felt like, oh my God, I'm stateless again because I'm not part of any countries or any territories. And so I go back to your organization, which is so important that we question where we are and where's something that I never questioned myself, about cultural identity and so on and so forth. And it's because of my trip to San Francisco, really, that that question really started to grow in my mind. So in Quebec today, because of art, because of I would say the writing, but also I am quite present on TV. I have a TV show and so on and so forth. So this Vietnamese phase basically is now part of the Quebec imagination. So yes, art is also part of us being owning this territory and this culture, which is also mine. I would say the French from Quebec. And so that's it. That's I didn't want to burst the bubble that Canada is perfect, but sometimes, yes, we're still not part of the conversation sometimes.
Well, our ambition is to become a television show, right? So we're going to take a cue from you, Kim, about that. But Philip, we have questions from the audience for our panelists.
Yes. So I think, in the vein, I think as we're pivoting to questions about the political and how art is political, and I think things that are sometimes maybe seemingly phenomenological about being Vietnamese are surprising. I'm gonna go to this question from Phúc Do, who asks, as they grew up in Vietnam and had assumed inaccurately that the Vietnamese identity was a more or less homogenous identity, could anyone share a time when you were surprised by something you learned about the Vietnamese diaspora and how diverse it is? I can kind of start. My surprising moment was when I learned of Pivot, the Progressive Vietnamese American organization, that it existed in 2016 when our former president was elected. And it was very surprising to me also to know that some of my favorite authors and folks that I have been reading and looked up to were also a part of that organization. So the first person that I'll pass this question to will be Thi. Oh, you're muted, Thi.
Because I was in Pivot.
Yes, you were like the first person who showed up on a Zoom, and I was like, what?
Yes, that's when you saw how small the community is. All Pivot people are directed to keep my email private, please, because I wear a different activist hat than I do an author hat, and I rarely write anybody back as an author. I was surprised when I was in Vietnam. It was hard for me to find information about the ethnic minorities in Vietnam in the US. And my Vietnamese reading is not good enough to skim books in a satisfactory way for me to do research. So I was in a Anglophone bookstore in Saigon and a few years back, and I found a book that was in Vietnamese and English that had a lot of photographs of 50-something ethnic minorities in Vietnam, and it was so nice just to have all the information, like the names and descriptions and a map of where people lived. And I was like, oh, here's this knowledge I should have grown up with. Finally, in a way that's accessible to me. And I guess our diaspora makes it complicated, right? Because we have so many different languages. But yeah, that was one moment. We haven't heard from Eric in a while.
Yeah, Eric, and you were the one that name dropped Pivot at the beginning of the conversation, so I'll pass it to you.
I guess the moments that I realized how diverse the Vietnamese diaspora was like really when I was in the South for my MFA program. Not only like I met the Vietnamese community in New Orleans. I've learned, I haven't visited them yet, but there's like this small community also in rural southern Alabama, like right by the Gulf as well. And like it just like really surprises me like where the diaspora kind of ended up, especially in America, like places you don't expect them, and then they create their own communities. So I think like when we talk about like a Vietnamese diaspora, or in this case a Vietnamese American experience, we can't really leave out like rural communities where Vietnamese people might end up, or like smaller towns, because like I feel like something is lost if you don't talk about those experiences, especially in places where you're especially different from everyone else. Yeah, so I can leave it off at that.
Vincent, what about you? A surprising diversity of diaspora moment?
Yeah, I think my most surprising diversity of diaspora moment was at some point when I was a teenager and I learned that my grandfather had 3 other wives in addition to my grandmother, and some of those wives at the same time, which was a concept that was new to me. And then as part of that, my own personal diaspora grew in that revelation to include a whole bunch of people still in Vietnam, and people in Australia, and people now in Malaysia and other places. And it was surprising to discover that my own diaspora was actually bigger than I'd realized.
And you, Kim?
Well, it makes it. I used to be a lawyer, and there was a big project between Canada and Vietnam. And one of the issue we got consulted by the Vietnamese was our work with First Nations. How do well, of course, Canada is really imperfect. It's imperfect. It's not, but we are a little bit more advanced than Vietnam, of course, on these issues. And so I was so happy that the Vietnamese considered, exploring how to include or how to start a conversation with the different. Ethnic minorities in Vietnam. But that was in the 90s. So I don't know what has been done up to now. We had a couple of working sessions, but maybe it was but still it's a drop in the ocean. But the drop existed, and maybe the question has been, addressed. And I hope that I have not followed up on it, so I don't know how it is now. But that was the moment where I discovered that, Vietnam is so rich of all these heritage, with this heritage from different ethnic minorities.
Right, and thank you all so much for sharing your moments of diasporic surprise. I think as many of our viewers have watched Accented and AccentediRL since our first show as an author talk series back in, I think, June of last year. Right, so we're almost at a year of doing this, of being online and hosting these intimate conversations with writers. We've really gotten a chance to also see the nuance in writers' lives and authors' lives, to know that they are not just writers themselves, right? And I want to bring up this question from Angelina Nguyen, who asks, for all guests, and I'll start with you, Viet, you all have other full-time jobs besides writing, and we know that because we definitely truncated your biographies during the intro. What's your writing routine like, especially when you're working in your full-time day jobs? And on your identity at the intersection of many things such as race, nationality, etc. How did you find your readership? And when you're writing, who do you write for? Who is your audience? I think Viet might have frozen, so I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Vincent Lam first.
Sure. So writing routine, I mean, it's just been different for me at different times in my life. I used to do a lot of shift work, and so I would basically write whenever I wasn't doing a shift, whether that was the day after a night shift or what have you. And then I had kids, and that was a really difficult. Well, I still have kids, but when they were really small, it was really difficult in terms of carving out time for writing. So it was important to be really kind of deliberate about doing that. And now I tend to have more day hours, and so I can set aside certain times for writing specifically. But then things happen, like a global pandemic, and for the past month and a half, I think I've had 2 days off or something because I'm immunizing people nonstop. So, I guess my point of saying all this is that, life is real and life happens. And hopefully we're fortunate enough to be doing other things that we also value deeply and care about. And I certainly feel that way. But the only way to get the writing done is to put aside time for the writing at some point, whether that's in big chunks or small chunks or longitudinally. I've met different people who do it differently. I think the other two questions, I think one was about finding readership. And I don't know. I think, readers just find you if there's something that resonates. So I don't really know. I think that's like a mystical process almost. And there's a question about intersections of nationality. I mean, I think for me, it's two things. I feel really privileged to be a BIPOC person and to be able to therefore both access multiplicities and also speak from that perspective. And then sometimes it also feels like, it's another weight on the shoulders, like, I have to be, or whether I have to be, I don't know, but I am conscious of how I'm viewed, and I'm conscious of how I'm representing both my specific BIPOC-ness as a person from the Chinese expatriate community of Vietnam, and as just a person who isn't white, and it's both a privilege and sometimes a weight, to be honest, both as a doctor and as a writer.
I was a high school teacher and a mother of a young son when I was writing. So I wrote during weekends and school breaks. But what was better than that was actually finding a community so that I wasn't writing alone. So I just want to take a second to pitch to people who are watching, if you're an author or an emerging author, to connect with DVAN, like get yourself in the listing, sign up for a workshop. Because it is a lot easier when you're in community with other people who are going through the process of trying to birth a book into the world. Because your family will say nice things to you, and your friends will encourage you, but they might not have the tools to give you feedback. So getting yourself a community of writers and fellow artists really helps.
Yeah, I agree with Thi. I think that's why I went and got an MFA, just because I didn't have a lot of people around me who wrote. So that community and an MFA program who are at first like strangers who can give you like really honest feedback, I think that's really important as a beginning writer, because you're trying to find your voice, and criticism does help. In terms of writing, for me, I have a 9-to-5 day job. Plus, I edit diacritics. So my free time is usually on the weekends, and I try to carve out time there to write. And I feel like being in an MFA program where I had to teach classes while taking classes really helped me really carve out times of my week to get writing done. I forgot the other questions, but I can pass it on.
On your readership, Eric.
I don't know if I found my readership. I mean, my book just came out last week. So we can see where that goes. But I've been lucky enough to hear from readers who have read my book, I feel, pretty quickly, which is cool. And I feel like I'm touching a lot of, like, the people who reach out to me are usually Southeast Asian Americans or queer people. And I feel like that's also my community, which is pretty cool to hear from.
I feel like I'm really privileged because I'm a full-time writer. I think this is all I do. But of course, well, I travel a lot, well, before the pandemic. And so I write a lot in airports and hotel rooms, and at home at my kitchen counter whenever I can, like between, I don't know why I'm cooking noodles or something like that. So, but it's true that I'm a lot on, well, I have many things to do with TV. So my days usually are for all these meetings or in a studio. So I mostly write between 11 at night and 4 in the morning. And that's the only time that I have in the day for writing or for reading, researching. Other than that, readership, in my case, because we we don't have many Vietnamese here, or the Vietnamese here in Quebec anyway, they feel like they know the story that I tell already, so they're not so interested. So I think most of my readership are from are Quebecers, and also schools. Many. The books are really used as how do you say that, to be taught in school. So I think they find me more than we can find the readership. You never know, how the book can speak to one person or the other. So I'm very surprised because I was not trained to be a writer. It came to me really accidentally. And then people gave me the title writer, and then now I try to be a writer, but it was accidental. It was really physically accidental because I bump into cars when, I fell asleep at red lights, and that's how I started taking notes. And a friend of mine took it to a publisher. So, and I still feel like I'm not really a writer. And listening to you, it's confirmed that I'm still not a writer.
That's so wild, Kim, that you would say that, because you are, I mean, all of you are so, I mean, integral to the canon of, diasporic Vietnamese literature. And that's also partially why we have you here in conversation tonight, is that you're contributing, like, as we're here, y'all's work is the ones that contribute, like, you are what we study in the academy, right? And Viet, you're back. And on the academy, on this question of, having, let me find this question. Having multiple jobs and doing things outside of being a writer, as well as, on when you find time to write yourself, as well as, finding your readership audience. How do you do it? How do you balance all these things?
Well, I think, Kim has the dream job, just being 100% writer. I hope I get to that stage sometime in my life, but it's really rare to be able to do that, simply because we have to pay the bills. And writing, for most people, doesn't pay the bills, at least when we're talking about poetry or fiction, these kinds of things. And so for me, I always had 2 jobs. And I think that's actually pretty common for writers. We have the job that pays the bills, and we have the other job of being a writer. And I think what's important for me here to acknowledge is that the only thing that makes someone into a writer, it's not the degree or anything like that. It's the fact that you read a lot and you write a lot. Those are the only things you need to be a writer. Now, you can go get a degree, you can take classes, you can read books about writing, all that. That's not going to hurt you. But unless you're able to spend time writing and reading, you're not going to get it done. So whatever you do to make a living, you got to make sure you carve out time to read a lot and to write a lot. So, for example, the first book of fiction that I wrote was called The Refugees. It was actually the second book of fiction that I published, but it was the first book that I wrote. It took me 17 years to write that book. And it took me thousands of hours to write that book. And I wrote that whenever I had the time available, in the evenings, on the weekends, when I wasn't grading, during the summers, on vacations, this kind of thing. And if I had known when I set off to write that book in my 20s that it would take me 17 years, I would have said, no way, I don't want to be a writer. This sounds like the worst bargain in the world. But because I was ignorant and stubborn, I just kept on going with it. And I think that's an experience that all writers encounter at some point or another. Some writers, they start off hot and young, they get their big book out there, everybody's talking about them. And some writers start off slow, like me. Like I didn't publish my first book of fiction until I was in my 40s. And I think the key here is that the young writer who started off hot and all that kind of stuff, I will bet you that, in almost every circumstance, that writer will reach a moment in their life when they're going to hit a major trough. Some huge challenge will come up personally or aesthetically and so on. And so if they didn't suffer earlier, they'll suffer later. Writers suffer. That's a part of being a writer. If you're not ready to suffer, if you don't want to suffer, if you can't take suffering, get another job. I said there's so many other things you could do with their life that would be more fun. But if you're willing to put in the thousands of hours required to be a writer, you can do it on your own time. And it doesn't matter how long it takes you. Like if you write 3 or 4 hours a day, you'll get there faster. If you write 3 or 4 hours a week, you'll get there eventually. You just got to do your thousands of hours. And now, fortunately, for those of us who are Vietnamese on the question of audience, we have an audience. We've built this audience. I mean, I would feel sorry for you if you were trying to write a book in the 1970s and 1980s, as people were actually trying to do. Imagine being a Vietnamese American trying to write in English in the 1970s or 1980s. If you were Vietnamese French or writing in French, it would be different because the Vietnamese were writing in French since like the early 20th century. But in English, you would have been so lonely, right? Now you're not lonely because, we have built a community of readership. And that's part of the mission of DVAN is like we looked around and we thought, we need to work for future generations to make sure that, when you're asking this question now as a younger person, you're not going to be alone, and you're not alone. And, we have people like Eric, born here in the United States, writing his first novel. And, what he's writing about would have been sort of unimaginable 20 years ago or, in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina was actually happening. So become a writer. You already have an audience, and then pay it forward and build the next generation of readership for future writers.
Thank you for that, Viet. And we are almost coming up on time. So I have one final question for all of our guests tonight. That are kind of in line of the questions that the audience has been asking about language. Like Kim asked if you have to drink the water to speak the language fluently to belong to the land. There are a couple of questions about audience, and I know that your works have appeared in English, but as well as in French and in Vietnamese, and have been translated across different languages. So my final question for all of you is there a piece of advice or word of advice that you would want to give to the audience members that are watching today and those who will watch this afterwards in any language or in all languages that you may speak? I'll pass it to Kim first.
Yeah, well, with my first book, it's very funny because some friends would read it and said to me, we know that we read it in French, but somehow it felt like they had read a Vietnamese book. Right. So I think, and there's one author who has said this very beautifully. He's a very known author here in Quebec, and he was born in Haiti. And he said, a summer in Haiti is never like a summer in Montreal, because a summer in Montreal is a summer which had known the winter. So the summer is different. And so I think this is why language is so beautiful, because even if we write in one language, it does carry the heritage that we have from the other languages. And so my French is tinted with, that Vietnamese sound, that the musicality of it, I think. And when it's translated into English, it's quite difficult as well because, the words and all of that. But when you have a great translator, it's not translation, it's almost like transposer, it's transposing. I don't know if it's a word in English, but to go from one culture and then put it in a different culture. It's not about language, it's really about culture. And so I remember the last version in English that I read, I didn't remember if I had read it in French or in English. And at the same time, very often I forget if I was, thinking in Vietnamese or in French. And that's the beauty of us all, I guess, to own at least two cultures, right, or three. So
I'm going to follow Kim's talk about beauty in language with something kind of profane. my experience with translation was translating my dad's interviews for the book. He likes to cuss a lot in Vietnamese, and he's got a very colorful language. I'll use one of the milder expressions. Like he called somebody like pangache in Vietnamese, which, like, if you translate it literally, it's quite silly. Like the dead chicken, the guy who was a dead chicken. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So you can't translate it directly. So I had a good time like coming up with like English equivalents that would like carry the same like comedy and like rhythm, I guess. So I think I translated it to like class A moron, which like has nothing to do with the original, but like it worked for me in the context. And yeah, there were other ones, but that was my favorite bit of translation that I got to do.
I'll pass it on to Vincent.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, my my advice around language, and this is a bit of technique advice perhaps, is whatever language you're writing in, read it out loud as you're editing. And I find that that's just incredibly helpful to engage in rhythm and to engage in the sense of how the words would feel if you were, for instance, reading it to someone. And for me, that's a really good editorial kind of step.
Eric, I'll pass to you.
I don't know much about translation because I'm most fluent in English. I lost like a lot of my Vietnamese along the way, but like I've been told that my writing feels like Vietnamese, like the way Kim said her writing has like that culture behind her. So I feel like even if I don't really know the language, I feel like growing up in that language, growing up in that culture really gave my own writing a particular rhythm, particular way of saying things. So I'm not sure if that's any advice, but I feel like any culture you grew up with, like you're going to take that with you, no matter what you're writing or how you're writing. It's part of you already.
And Viet, last but not least, to close us out and wrap us up.
Well, I'm just so delighted that we have people here who've been writing in multiple languages and can work across different languages. And the one thing I'll say about this in my own experience is that writers are not translators. And these are two really different functions. Writers could be translators, but writers are not translators. And I want to stress this because I think so many people who are categorized as being a minority in some kind of given language or national community sometimes feel it's their obligation to translate. They want to translate their minority experience to the larger community. And I think that there is obviously, a reason to do that in certain occasions. If you're writing a cookbook, for example, or if you're writing a sociology book, but for writing fiction or poetry, I don't think we should translate. I imagine myself, for example, if I was a writer in Vietnam, would I translate? No. If I was a writer in Vietnam, I would write in Vietnamese, and I would assume my audience is Vietnamese, and I would assume they would get exactly what it is that I'm talking about. And I would hope that my work would be translated into other languages so that people, for example, in Canada or the United States could read my work in translation. But the work is not meant for them. I mean, the work is meant for other Vietnamese people. And then these Canadians and these Americans can read the work in translation and eavesdrop in on a conversation between Vietnamese people, which is exactly how I've always felt in the United States. I don't have a problem reading the literatures of white people, but I don't expect them to translate to me. I know that I have to do a little bit of work to hear what it is that they're saying. So likewise, when I write in English, I write thinking that my audience, first and foremost, is me, and second is other Vietnamese people, and third is everyone else who I'm not translating to. But I expect that they will do the work of paying attention as I have had to pay attention to English language and French language literature as well. So keep that in mind if that's inspiring at all for you. I just think it's amazing that we have writers here writing in French, writing in English, who in my mind have not sought to translate themselves, but have have sought to bring audiences to them with maintaining this sincerity and this authenticity and this power in their voices and their stories and what they want to do. And I that's what I hope for all of you out there who are writers and who want to be writers. Be sincere, be authentic, write for people who are like you. Don't try to apologize or translate to other people because you think they may have some kind of influence or power over what it is that you do. All right, so stay strong, stay powerful, stay diasporic. I want to thank our guests. But first of all, Kim has something urgent to say. She's waving at me like Bernie Sanders.
I just want to bounce back on what you said, that we all have to suffer. No, it's not true. It's possible to just have fun as well when you write, so and when you suffer too much, maybe you can stop it a little and then start later on. But up to now, Vic, I have not suffered yet. And I'm 52 now, so I hope I won't suffer at all until the end. But it's possible that there's no suffering.
We have two possible different realities, suffering and non-suffering. We'll see. Go start writing, and then we'll see where you end up. But thank you, Kim. Thank you, Thi. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you to DJ Puzzle and Philip for guiding us along the way, and to Toy Ifan, our mixologist, Mixophoria on Instagram, for providing us with the golden hour. We'll see you soon. I don't know when. We're taking a break for a summer holiday, but we will be back with more from the world of diasporic Vietnamese arts and literature. Bye, folks.
Thanks, Philip and Viet, for all you've done, and Puzzle and Thuy.
Thank you.